Okay, looks like we're live. Welcome, everybody. My name is Alexander Pedikov. I'm your host. This is Sasquatch Out of the Shadows Live, as always. To any new viewers, please feel free to subscribe and check out the previous installments of Sasquatch Out of the Shadows Live. There's a playlist you can check out. It's got all of them. We're up to 18 now. God, I'm really bad at keeping track of this, but next week we are going to have on author and researcher Lyle Blackburn, who many of you may know as one of the researchers into the Boggy Creek, the Fouke monster in Arkansas, and a lot of other southern Bigfoot type creatures and legends such as the Lizard Man, other stories. Real excited to have Lyle on. That should be great. But for tonight, we actually are really excited to have on author, researcher, and lecturer Paul Bartholomew. So Paul is from Whitehall, New York. Over the years, Paul has gathered stories of Bigfoot-like creatures in Whitehall, New York, and the surrounding areas in upstate New York, as well as Vermont, investigating many of the sightings, including other topics like the Lake Champlain monster and UFOs. He has authored various books on these topics, such as Monsters of the Northwoods, Mysteries of the Northwoods, Bigfoot Encounters in New York and New England, and he's appeared on countless television programs or documentaries such as MonsterQuest, Finding Bigfoot, Small Town Monsters documentaries, and other works. So Paul obviously has done a lot, and we're really interested in a lot of the stuff that he has, especially, just having been up there recently. And we'll talk about this. So without further ado, let's bring Paul in.
Hi,
how you doing? Good. Thanks so much for coming on, Paul.
Anytime. It's a pleasure.
Great. It's just awesome to have you on. We met for the first time recently, just I think end of June. That was when we were filming the Small Town Monsters on the trail of Bigfoot, The Journey, which we did a recap a couple episodes ago. If you guys want to check that out with Seth and Andy. And we spent some time in your archive there, and it was just, I was like a kid in the candy store. I mean, it was just amazing. You have one of the coolest collections of Bigfoot and paranormal and all sorts of stuff up there. So let's start out kind of with the basics. What got you interested in, what brought you down this path of researching and looking into the mysteries of the area?
Well, I've always had an interest in paranormal phenomena, and going back to when I was a child. But there was a major UFO flap in the 70s, 1973, which actually hit this area as well. And these were the cases, Pascagoula, Mississippi, the coin helicopter case. There were some real classic incidents, including a landing case that happened up here in Glen Lake, New York. And that really piqued my interest. Of course, I would have been about 9 years old back then. And then a couple years later, 3 years later, in 1976, we had a major Bigfoot outbreak right here in Whitehall. And at that time, you thought of the Bigfoot or Sasquatch phenomena as being sort of the Pacific Northwest, be it California, Washington, Oregon, British Columbia, that type of thing. So to have it in New York State, literally in our own backyards here, was absolutely terrific. And so that sort of launched a journey into looking at how many sightings really are there in this area that's been overlooked. And when we started to look into it, back in 1978, you had John Green, who had put out that fabulous Sasquatch, the Apes Among Us.
Amazing read.
Incredible. And he had, I think, maybe 11 cases in New York and, 4 or 5 in Vermont, something like that. So we basically took those areas and expanded them. And we ended up with hundreds of cases. So you can imagine, if you look at that on a national level and then on a global level, the amount of cases that are reported is infinitesimal compared to the amount of cases that have happened. So our job was to document as closely as possible how many sightings there are, what's going on, and just take down the information as accurately as possible. And we basically made it into 3 different categories of track finds, eyewitness sightings, and vocalization reports. And that's what we've been doing for, basically 40 plus years now.
Incredible. I mean, you've done so much of the interesting work, and Whitehall in that area in upstate New York seems to be a hotspot for just Bigfoot activity in general. And before we continue, people are kind of giving me some trouble for my shirt here, apparently, in the comments. Jonathan Wilk is asking, what shirt is that? Somebody got it right. It's a Red Star Belgrade soccer shirt. I'm wearing it because I'm actually taking a break on a job here, and it's very hot. So it's like an athletic shirt. So they're good for wicking the sweat. So we've dispelled that. So back to our scheduled programming. But thanks, guys, for kind of making some fun in the comments there. So Whitehall in particular, what about the area that you're in? And this is something I asked Steve Coles as well when we had him on. What about that area do you think is so interesting, or geographically, could you talk about it a little bit to maybe somebody who isn't familiar with Whitehall and the surrounding area?
Yeah, we're up around the Vermont border. We're about 5 miles from Vermont, from Fairhaven, and we're about 4 hours from Canada. And so we're upper New York. We're away from the city, but we're in a rural area. We're in an international area, really, because Canada's only 4 hours away. So it's in the Adirondacks is a rugged area that they used to do promos, and they used to take a map of the Adirondacks and put major, like Yellowstone and major national parks right inside of the map to show how big the Adirondacks is. And I don't think people fully appreciate just how rugged some of the terrain up here is. We can appreciate the Pacific Northwest and stuff, but boy, the Adirondacks can be pretty rugged. And we had a great example of that with the prison escape up in Dannemora,
right,
which became national news. It took weeks to recover those prisoners, and they made classic mistakes. One shot at a camper, and the other ran across an open field. All the technology that was employed, the helicopters, the searches, the information, the social media networks, the posters, whatever, none of it actually is what actually turned those prisoners, up. So it just shows just how rugged an area that the Adirondacks can be.
Oh, yeah. And I didn't really have a full appreciation for that, I suppose, until recently when we were up there and when I met you. As you know, we flew around with a helicopter above the high peaks, and we were filming kind of right in the high peaks wilderness. And as somebody who's from New Hampshire, I can appreciate how, an area is underrated. We have the White Mountains and a lot of these areas in the Northeast and Maine that I think a lot of people kind of goes over the radar because they think, oh, Pacific Northwest, the Rocky Mountains, the Adirondacks. I mean, it dwarfs all these areas in terms of size as a park. And as you said, really rugged areas. And I think we all came to the conclusion after that adventure really in the Adirondacks that if there was a place something like a Bigfoot could be, this was definitely an area where it would be, no doubt.
Sure,
and it was just so interesting to be there. So let's get right into it. One of my questions was, you've been in it such a long time, but is there one particular Bigfoot story to you that kind of stands out? And maybe this could be an eyewitness you've spoken to or an encounter that you investigate. Is there anyone that sticks out, or is that a bit of a loaded question?
No, that's a fair question. I think it's more the number of credible cases that crop up time and time again that create this pattern of sightings that goes way back into modern times. Now, if we want to talk about personal encounters that have happened around this area that I've talked to the witnesses and stuff, I would put people like Dan Gordon, who was a police officer in Whitehall, who had a sighting with another police officer and it was a routine sighting. Driving along, creature crosses the road in front of them, they're stunned. Dan ended up taking a polygraph and stuff. This was back in February of 1982. And for the longest time, Dan was known as a law enforcement official because he didn't even want to be known as a police officer because he didn't want to be known as the Bigfoot cop. And so he had this stigma attached to him. And yet Dan was my neighbor. He was a very honest guy. And, this was a tough thing for him to have to deal with for 20 years. And then finally he came out, with a couple of documentaries, doing interviews and explaining his story. And the first step was that he met with producer Doug Hijack for Mysterious Encounters. And he said, you can film me talking about it, but don't use my name. And then the next step was MonsterQuest for the History Channel. And then he came out and used his name. And then he actually was involved in another MonsterQuest. That was actually Giganto, the original, the precursor of MonsterQuest. Right. And then he did a MonsterQuest episode in which he took a polygraph and passed, no problems. And he was with another police officer at the time. So that becomes a hard case for skeptics to just dismiss, because you could always say, well, he imagined it or whatever, but would two of the officers imagine it? Would they, it just seems more and more likely that they saw something fantastic. And it's such a common encounter to have a road crossing sighting. In fact, we're just coming up on the couple of year anniversary of an encounter that occurred in Whitehall, outside of Whitehall, New York. I think it was August 7th. And the gentleman was driving along. It was about 10:10 in the evening. And he's heading to help someone who had car trouble. So he's not thinking, he's just trying to get to the area. And he saw a creature crossing the road, stepping over a guardrail. And we went to the scene the next day within hours. And there were what looked like could have been tracks right there, but it was not the best terrain to,
Right.
to have a sighting, to have a casting rather. But I tried to duplicate the step over the guardrail and I couldn't do it. And so whatever this was very big. And he said he could see the legs and the outline of the body and the head and so forth. So that is a typical sighting. It's the same type of sighting that Dan and this other police officer had back in 1982. It goes on year after year after year, very consistently. And they become confirmation moments. Now, another one of those confirmation sightings I would use would be Cliff Sparks sighting. Now, it's May of 1975. Cliff Sparks is the owner of the Skeene Valley Country Club, located right on Norton Road in Whitehall, New York. And they actually have that as their emblem now for their country club.
That's right.
And
it's a very cool spot.
Yeah. He's got this beautiful golf course. And he was driving, it was about 11 o'clock at night. He's driving in one of the golf carts out. And he takes the hoses off of this green, puts them onto that green, that normal stuff, routine stuff. And he brings his dog with him usually. And the dog rides with him, gets out, runs around, gets back in the cart. They go to the next green and so forth. They do this day after day after day. Well, this one night in May of 75, he's out there, gets up to green 1, and there's a creature standing on the green. And he described it as being between 7 and 8 feet tall. He said it was a conical shaped head and that it moved sloth-like. And he said he felt it was as scared of him as he was of it. And he said he was just stunned. And he says his dog that normally gets out and runs all over, he said just subdued himself over the edge of the cart and stayed right there. And the creature crashed through the brush and disappeared into that little clump of woods off of green number 1. In fact, the emblem, which 17, 18 years later became the mascot of the country club, is green 1 when you look at it. So Cliff said, though, that the most interesting characteristic, the thing that bothered him, and this is a detail that if I wanted to make a sighting more credible, I wouldn't use it. He said that it had red glowing eyes. And he said that the eyes were emanating, not reflective. Because I get this all the time where people say, well, it's eye shine.
Right.
Well, I had an interview with him. I played not long ago and posted on Facebook of him talking. And he said specifically, it's not like eye shine. He said it was like short dots, almost like a laser coming out of the eyes. And he said he was just stunned. And now that's a characteristic that I didn't expect. And when we started researching these cases, I didn't expect things like that to pop up. The Abear Road incident that happened in 1976 happened a year later. And that's
I was just going to ask about that. Yeah.
Right. So Cliff had this sighting and he's kept it this dark secret. We only got that sighting because we were friends of the family. And, Cliff was a farmer and stuff. And my dad was a farmer in the Whitehall area. They both had daughters that went to Whitehall school. So we knew each other fairly well. And we knew Cliff was honest, just like we knew Dan was honest. So these sightings are very credible. And for people that try to pick them apart, it's just not that way. These people are solid. Yeah. And so the next sighting, the next huge incident that happened was the Abear Road incident, because that involved several law enforcement agencies. So a year and a few months later, August of 1976, August 24th, we've got 3 teenagers. Actually, we'll start the long version. There's 2 teenagers out on Abear Road. They see something, they're not sure what it is. A large creature. They speed away and pick up a 3rd teenager. They come back to the site and they park their truck. And a short time later, they hear a noise and they see this large creature near a telephone pole on Abear Road. So this is sort of the condensed version. They speed away, leaving, I think it was 57 feet of black rubber in the road. They take off. They back then you had a police dispatcher on duty. It was a great job. You'd stay that you watch TV, you answer a couple calls all night. It was a wonderful job. So you go right to the police station if there's a problem. Well, they did. So Whitehall police responded. The Washington County deputy sheriff responded, and the New York State troopers responded all to the scene. And there were, over a couple-day period, there were multiple sightings, and the story just grew and grew and grew. And even when Seth came up to shoot the documentary on Abear, he even turned up more witnesses. And this is 40 years later.
Wow.
And so we've got probably over a dozen witnesses that saw something over a week-long period. Now, what looks like it was basically a Bigfoot outbreak turned out to be more layered and more complicated and more convoluted than I would have ever imagined. My job as a researcher isn't to prove Bigfoot's there. My job is to take down the information as accurately as possible, regardless of whether it fits or doesn't fit, and take it down and record it. That's what we've done for 40 years. Turns out that this was during a major UFO flap right in the Northeast. It went all the way down to Westchester County, and there were some alerts with the nuclear power plant down there, with the guards seeing unidentified objects. When you look back at August of 1976, you'll see this entire Northeast was under a siege of UFO activity. When the Channel 13 news out of Albany came up and did a report, they started with the UFO story and then did the creature story. The WRGB story with Tracy Egan started with the creature story. If you read the New York paper, the Post-Star, officers track creature. If you read the Rutland Herald article, same week, it talked about little green men and hairy beings, kind of a flippant title, but it was addressing the UFO aspect as well.
Right.
So we have this convoluted outbreak of weird phenomena going on. We add to this reports by some hunters of a pterodon type bird, a big bird, a thunderbird, however you want to phrase it, was sighted, and it said it was almost like it was with liquid reality is the phrase they used. Very unusual and something I wasn't expecting in 76. And so we just take down all this information, and it turns out that what happened in that time frame of about a week-long period was more of a paranormal outbreak than it was just a cryptozoological incident. So we have all this phenomena going on. So I talked with Bob Martell, who was the dispatcher who was on duty. He had that job at the Whitehall police station. And he said he couldn't recall whether it was a week before or a week after. But he said a woman of the Abear Road incident. He said a woman called and said that she was on 2nd Avenue in Whitehall. Now that's only 2 streets over from the police station. And she said, an object just landed on my lawn. And Wilfred Goslin, who was the sergeant at the time, and police dispatcher Bob Martell, they both got in the car and went to see it. And when they got there, she said it's gone now. But she said Bob Martell said he could reach down this matted down circular area and he could still feel heat coming off the ground where something had landed. So we have that aspect as well, which you would not expect. So the Abear Road incident became this very convoluted paranormal outbreak that occurred right in line with the, Cliff Sparks sighting, with Dan Gordon's sighting later on. And so it forms this pattern of weird phenomena that's been reported in this area.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I don't think a lot of people are aware of those circumstances that surround the Abear Road incident. Obviously, the Abear Road incident is one of the most famous, I'd say, on the East Coast, or at least in the Northeast now, in terms of sightings or kind of a mass event like that. It was really interesting, having been to Abear Road a couple times. Now it's a little bit more built up from what I've heard than it was back in the day. There's some houses coming up. But as I was out there just back in June, as I was filming some B-roll, I think at the time Seth was interviewing you, or getting ready to interview you down by the Champlain Canal, and I had an Amish kid on a horse go right by my camera and just kind of looked right into the camera as I was filming a shot of the Abear Road sign. It was like a perfect little moment. But we then hung around there at night as well with Steve Culls, and then we walked down to the Polteny River, I believe it is.
Right.
And it was just such a creepy feeling. There was this mist coming off. There were bats flying above us. And I could just almost picture being back that many years ago, just imagining what these people saw, this creature with his glowing red eyes. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about the additional phenomena that was going on that I think a lot of people perhaps that are really just focused on the Bigfoot topic kind of disregard or don't really take into account that maybe all this stuff was going on at the same time. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, Cliff Sparks, it bothered him, but he never changed his story. And it was a characteristic if someone was going to hoax, and we know that that's not the case with Cliff, we know he's honest as could be, but if someone were going to hoax, they wouldn't bring that characteristic up. And
right.
It's something that's significant when you look at the old vernacular of some of the writings and the historical accounts. They'll say things, particularly in the Northeast, of things like the eyes were red like burning embers. And
right.
they'll come up with this characteristic time and time again. And it seems to be a little more than just eye shine.
Yeah, that's something I've heard as well in New England, where people have said, we've seen the glowing red eyes in the windows looking at the kids at night or things like that. And eye shine, obviously, is when you shine a light in the direction of a deer or an animal. The light is bouncing back, but that's what differentiates these reports is the presence of glowing or red or even orangish color without any source of light, which is very unusual, no?
Yeah. And another point that Cliff made was he said that the eyes, when those, he called them short dots, seemed to be coming out laser-like, he said they were pointing at the dog. And he said that's when the dog was completely subdued. And that was extremely unusual. Now, we had another characteristic out on Abear Road back in, I think it was 78 or so, where a fellow went to bed clutching a shotgun to his chest because of the vocalizations that were occurring around him. And he was right on the edge of Abear Road. And he said that he had a very vicious dog. And he said it was whimpering under his bed while these vocal displays were going on. And he said that dog was notorious for like chasing a bull and things like that. So it shows there's certainly a bit of a respect among the animals for whatever these things are.
Absolutely. What an interesting area. I think we had a comment where Daniel says, good Lord, it's like a Stranger Things like region. And then we had, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was saying, I agree.
Jonathan Wilkes says, Whitehall is a must-see for any Bigfoot enthusiastic person. Paul is the go-to guy. I couldn't agree more on both points.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I have a great appreciation for Jonathan and Dave and all those guys up there. They're great people.
Oh, they're awesome. Some of my favorite in New England. I was just talking to John earlier about some stuff they've had going on in their area. We got a question from Raptor Crazy. Wasn't this guy the mayor in Whitehall for a year or two, or is he still mayor?
Me? No,
Yeah.
no,
He
never been
also
married.
said he looks like the guy who was on Finding Bigfoot. Yeah, and that's you were actually.
No, I'll tell you the difference is the mayor was named Ken Bartholomew, and
Oh yeah, that's
we're
I'm sure that's
actually
how I got confused.
yeah we weren't actually related, but I knew Ken, and he was mayor I think a couple terms, and yeah, that's probably where the confusion came up. There was also a confusing report in a book one time that I was Dan Gordon's partner, police officer partner that was riding with him that night, and that's not true either. I've never been a police officer, so it's funny how some of these things pop up time and time again.
Lost in translation or something along those lines.
Yeah.
So we've got a question from Chris Spitzer. He says, "Question to Paul: is that a cast by your side? What's the story behind it?"
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I was going to ask.
Yeah, I've got a few casts here I thought you might want to take a look at. This is from 1985. Absolutely. And this is one of three, and I'll show all three. That's the first one. This one here. And then this one here will show some real detail. This is the third one of this. And you can see where the toes and so forth are on this. This is a 14-inch cast from the West Rutland, Vermont area. And these were cast by a school teacher named Mel Loomis, who gave them to Professor Cook, who was the professor at Castleton College. And that was an incident that occurred in 1985. And it was a very credible incident that involved, it's one of those rare times when you have the sighting, the track find, and the vocalization reports all together. And so it was a major incident that occurred. Now, interestingly, this was on Old Route 4A, which is not far from Castleton College, where I went to college, where Professor Cook taught. A year later, a year and a week, it was October 1st of 1986, Dr. Cook's daughter had a sighting as she was driving back on that road, and it was almost in the exact same spot. And she had actually spun her car out to avoid a skunk. And when, the dust settled, the creature ran right in front of her headlights of the car. So she had this amazing sighting a year after that other sighting. And so we have these, and that is suggestive to some of a migration route. I don't know. Yeah. I'm just throwing it out there. We do seem to have a large number of sightings in August, September, and October in this region. Now, some good friends of mine would say if the creature has connections to other paranormal phenomena, why would it need to migrate? And, that's a fair point. I don't know. We're just in the case of taking down the information as accurately as possible, and hopefully it'll yield some answers down the road.
Absolutely. I mean, and you're doing a very interesting work. There's no doubt about it that Whitehall is just one of these regions, and in New York in general, I think the whole Northeast has a lot of these really interesting stories, but Whitehall in particular just being that sort of pocket. And I think along that note, we'll take this question here from Crash Course Cryptozoology, Carrick, who's a friend of the show. What percentage of the Bigfoot reports that Paul get display these very strange characteristics, small dots, or accompanying UFO sightings?
Interesting. A lot of times, you see, the whole way that reports are taken nowadays are different with social media and stuff. Back in the day, you used to have to go through clippings and things. So you may come across a Bigfoot encounter, and you won't, like if I had gotten the Post-Star report, I wouldn't have gotten the UFO aspect of the Ape Bear Road incident. Whereas if I had had the Rutland Herald article, I would have had the UFO aspect as well as a total picture of what was going on. So it's kind of difficult. I don't know what the exact percentage is, but it seems like when you just take the layers away from what looks like might be a very straightforward sighting, you start to reveal these other phenomena that are occurring. And I'll give you a classic example. if we step away from the Bigfoot phenomenon and look directly at the UFO phenomena, the Pascagoula, Mississippi case involved Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. And they claim to have been floated aboard a UFO in 1973 and given some sort of exam or what appeared to be that. And it seemed like an outrageous story, but very credible. The police were convinced that this had happened to them, that they were extremely sincere about their experience. Well, it turns out years later, Ray Stanford said that Charles Hickson said that he felt something was following him around, these objects. And so they invited him to Texas, and he came down there, and they were able to track an object that appeared to be following him with their equipment back then at Project Starlight International. Calvin Parker has recently come forward to write a couple of books about his experience with that incident. And he talks about other types of phenomena that happened to him as well, be it poltergeist, things like this. So these things are oftentimes layered. I don't know what the percentage would be, but I would think that when you collect a report, just be aware that this other phenomena, this other shoe might drop.
Definitely. That's something to keep in mind, I think, absolutely. And as we've talked about, sometimes researchers sort of kind of try to make things fit one certain paradigm or maybe a view that they're having. So it's important to just take other circumstances, other events into mind. I think that's just a really good thing to do in general.
Absolutely.
So the Nature Navigator says, I've got stuff going on in Mariah, New York, which is actually really close to Port Henry, which is well known for champ stuff, as is Whitehall in some way. So I think that's a little great segment real quick into something about champ. So I'm, as you know, I'm a big fan of the Lake Champlain monster and champ from my miniseries to just kind of peripherally. I'm just really interested in it as a cryptid. It's one of my favorite cryptids. Whitehall has a long history associated with champ, whether it's with the Whitehall Times or sightings in the 1870s. I understand you and your brother's wrote a fantastic book, which I would recommend anyone interested in champ about it. How did you guys kind of get interested in the champ stuff, or was it by accident, or what kind of led to that?
Well, my brother went to college at Plattsburgh University, and there was a professor up there named Phil Rines. And, Phil was one of the main people at that conference that they had in Shelburne in 1981. And he was an expert on the phenomena. And of course, we knew Joe Zarzinski, who was a school teacher and became an expert, on Lake Champlain monster. He used to lecture. We saw Joe when he lectured down in Fort Fest back in 1978, Washington University. And we saw Joe give lectures around here. Great guy. And he does a lot of the bateau below research into subs and things like that, logging shipwrecks on Lake Champlain and Lake George and so forth. Terrific guy. And he documented a lot of the champ phenomena. So we knew Joe and we knew Dr. Rines. And so I was able to go to the Shelburne conference, and I recorded all the lectures there. And so that's kind of how we got into it. And then, of course, back then, the big controversy was the Manzi photo, which was taken. Of course, Bob's done an expose on that. Very interesting. The phenomena is, it's the history that sells these phenomena. This isn't anything that was manufactured recently. And if we look at cryptozoology in general, you'll have an incident like the chupacabra, the goat sucker, that's cited in Puerto Rico and Florida and Texas and down in that area, those regions. If you really look closely, you might be able to get a case back in the 70s, make a case for an incident in the 70s. But generally speaking, that phenomena occurred about the mid 1990s. And that's when the implosion of information about those creatures began. With the Bigfoot phenomenon, with the champ phenomena, it goes back centuries. So this is nothing new. It's very historic. And for the skeptic who says,
I think we're having some audio issues there on your end, Paul. Can you hear me?
I can.
Can you guys? Oh, can you guys hear him? If somebody can hear Paul, okay, just leave a comment in there. I'm just getting a little bit of feedback. I want to make sure it's not just on my end. I can always unplug my headphones and see if that'll help. Let's see.
Okay,
Do you want to? Sounds good. Yeah, maybe that was just the headphones. I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, my point being that the Champ phenomena and the Bigfoot phenomena are different from the Chupacabra phenomena in that there's a long traditional history here, and that for the skeptic who says, there's nothing to it, it's whatever, it's a win-win, because it's important to study why we're seeing these. If this is part of the human experience, then that's as important to study than if it's a real creature or if it's paranormal, whatever. It's a win-win as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and that's something that really, which is surprising. What surprised me when I initially started looking at the Champ stuff for my series was the history. There's so much to it, just even the history of the lake itself and that whole region that really kind of sold me that this is just such a multifaceted sort of mystery, that there's a lot going on. And one of my favorite things about going to a place like Whitehall nowadays is that you have the local embrace of Bigfoot. You have, like you mentioned, the Skeene Valley golf course there. They have the Bigfoot in the logo. You have, Bigfoot in front of the pizza shop. You've got Bigfoot all over the place. And then you also have Champ's restaurant because Lake Champlain ends right at Whitehall. So if you're into cryptids, this area is a perfect spot. You can go from Whitehall to Port Henry up to Burlington all within a day and have an incredible scenic, beautiful area has a rich history of Bigfoot, Champ, UFO, and all sorts of other stuff that has happened there.
And this is something that didn't happen easily. When the Bear Road incident happened, when Cliff Sparks incident happened, even when Dan Gordon's incident happened, this was a negative. And that's important to realize. These witnesses had everything to lose and nothing to gain by coming forward. And in many cases, this was a life changer. For Dan Gordon, it changed his life because he didn't think there was anything to this. And now he's face to face with it, but he can't talk about it. For many people, this was a negative. So it took a long time for that positive to come around. Back when Bear happened, many of the people thought this was an outright hoax, even though they just didn't know about the rest of the phenomena that had occurred in this area. So this took a long time for this to transition into a positive. And I'm glad we had a part of that. And I think one of the things we did, which was to bring this to light, was the same thing that Champ, they did in Port Henry, the same thing that Skomania County did in Washington for Bigfoot, is they drew up ordinances. And we did the same thing for Whitehall, so that Bigfoot is a protected creature in the Whitehall village and town in this whole region. So what it does is, while it's symbolic, first of all, it's in honor of Professor Cook in his research in this region, in his contributions. Back in the 80s, Dr. Cook tried to get Bigfoot put on the endangered species list, contacting Madeline Kunin, the governor of Vermont at the time, and actually took it all as far as you could take it. Obviously they declined, but they said, we respect that and we encourage you to keep going with this. So the legislation I drew up was sort of a cross between the Port Henry legislation and the Skomania County, and it embraces Whitehall, but more than that, it embraces the phenomena and the traditional history from the Algonquin to the Iroquois to the stone giants, the giant men of the mountains, the Gugu that Samuel Champlain saw, and on and on and on. This is all part of our history, and now it's wonderful that we're finally embracing it. Nobody should have had a sighting and had to keep quiet about it. And unfortunately, that was the case for many, many decades.
Right. And that's just wonderful. I think we're coming to a point where almost cryptid tourism is really being embraced, I think, around the world. You see, obviously, Loch Ness is a golden example of this. Lake Champlain, much less so, but you still have that embrace of Champ and Whitehall and places like Fouke, Arkansas, which we'll talk about with Lyle next week. They've kind of, it's taken a while. And that's what I've heard from multiple places, even a place like Willow Creek. There wasn't really a warm reception at first until people said, hey, there's an interest in this. There's people coming from across the world, across the country, just to come and take a picture with a sign or stroll by Abear Road or do whatever. And I think that's really cool, especially for those of us interested in this phenomena. Of course, that is something that we love to see, the embrace, and even just a gift shop selling little things that commemorate an incident or an event. I think that's really neat.
Well, we had that with the telephone pole out on Abear Road. People used to come from Australia and New Zealand to get their picture taken next to that telephone pole. So Finding Bigfoot came up to shoot the documentary that they did on Whitehall, and they went out and they shot this pictures of the pole and people standing next to the pole and describing the sightings. And a National Grid truck pulls up, and Matt Moneymaker's there, and he says, hey, do you know the history of this pole? He's talking to the driver, and the driver's listening, and Matt's giving him the history of it. And he goes, that's really interesting. It's coming down tomorrow. And it wasn't anything nefarious. It just happened that they were taking down a whole line of poles, and that was one of them. So when you see the Finding Bigfoot episode on Whitehall, that's the last time the pole was filmed.
Right. Wow. And I think I remember hearing the story about even when Seth said when he was doing the series, I think the pole was initially there when he was filming his documentary, and then it was he came back for a shoot later and it was gone or something along those lines. But it's amazing. So that pole, that infamous pole, is just probably was ground up or recycled or put into some other purpose. So that's kind of a funny ending for something so historic.
Well, there's a chunk of it up at Lauren Coleman's museum up in Maine that I got with a hacksaw. Took me forever, but it's up there anyways.
Piece of it memorialized. Yeah. That's great. So here's a question from Glenn H. He asks, what's the largest footprint you've heard of in the Vermont, New York, Massachusetts area?
Well, we get two footprints that are pretty consistent, and we get all the sizes in between and some larger. We get 14 inches a lot, and we get 19 inches a lot. But I've heard of bigger than 19, but of course you got to be careful with snow melt and things like that. But 19 seems to be one of the larger, and 14 seems to be pretty common. And one theory behind it is that 14 may be a full-grown female, 19 may be a full-grown male. Just throwing it out there. But yeah, I don't see too many cases of more than 20 inches. That would be a rarity.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just interesting to hear that. And one of my favorite tracks that you showed us was, I think, the one that had the stick that was still in it. That was great. You might even have it close by.
Got it right here. Yep.
Check this out, guys. That is pretty cool. So what's the story behind this guy?
Well, this is from April 8th of 1993. And this is in Rutland Town, Vermont. And it was one of three. This is a second one. I don't know if I can get the perspective of it here.
Yeah.
But we're talking about 14 inches in length, a little narrower than the others. But you can put these literally on top of each other, and you can see how that 14 inches seems to come up time and time again.
Absolutely. Now, I'm having a problem with my comments here. The questions seem to be not loading, but here's a question from my buddy Stefan, who asked, Paul, how often do you revisit witnesses you've already interviewed? For example, the witness account over the guardrail on Route 4 in Whitehall.
Well, actually, you got to interview or to listen to that interview. The most recent time I talked to him, that was 2 years ago that his incident happened, or around 2 years ago. We just came up on the second anniversary of it. He talked with Seth back in, it was June, right? And gave his account again. So yeah, I hear them. Usually when you run into somebody, they might mention it again or mention another case. It happens pretty frequently. That witness, obviously, we've heard his story multiple times over just a 2-year period. And I remember there were people up here from BFRO shortly after his incident had happened, and while he didn't want to go public, he did talk with them as well, so they can further verify that account as well.
Right. Yeah, it was very interesting to hear that story and just, another sort of drop in the puddle of what is Whitehall and some of the accounts. It was just very interesting for me to hear that. So
yeah, and we talk about Whitehall, but Rutland has a big history. Chittenden, Vermont has a big history. And of course, Seth had found out about, Kinderhook, New York.
Yeah.
Having the Kinderhook creature down there. So we have these pockets of places that have strange phenomena associated with them. And the general characteristic is they have a long history of this phenomena. If you go to Chittenden, you're talking about the basically the birth of spiritualism up there with the people from the other world book there, Olcott and stuff. So we have rich histories in all of these regions, and I'm inclined to think that the older places you go to, you're going to find this phenomena just as accurately as you'll find the revolutionary stuff and the other historical stuff. Because another thing Whitehall is noted for, it's one of the 4 or 5 places that claim to be the birthplace of the U.S. Navy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just so much history stacked on top of itself, basically. And if you're looking at it strictly from no Bigfoot, no paranormal stuff, you have more than enough to entertain you. But then you throw this into it, and hopefully we'll get to a point where it's viewed as just a normal part of the history, or just a part of it, instead of being this fringe topic. Oh, this town is kind of kooky because they're into Bigfoot and all this stuff,
right.
and that there's an embrace. And I really like that it's been changing. So we have a question from Kevin Hamilton. I can't pull it up. Unfortunately, my comments are not loading on here, but he asks, do either of you have a favorite fictional movie with Bigfoot as the theme?
Interesting. Do you have one?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. There was this one, maybe it's just because it was one of the first ones I saw. I mean, aside from Harry and the Hendersons, there was this movie called Bigfoot the Journey, I believe. Mm-hmm. And it was in the 1990s about a boy who gets lost in the woods and befriends Bigfoot. And they have this famous scene where Bigfoot is fighting this bear. And that costume that they designed for that is now a pretty famous one that's used in a lot of recreations. And you can rent it. It's one of the higher grade, I guess, Bigfoot costumes that's rentable. So I guess I would say that one.
There have been some really god-awful Bigfoot movies. But there have been a couple that have been really neat. And I think the one that jumps out at me was Creature from Black Lake.
Oh, yeah.
And that one was a really fun one. You get a few like that. And it's like the old documentaries. That National or Smithsonian Institute documentary special that was broadcast in, I think it was 1975. I think that's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen. And it was tantalizing. And it was an hour special. It was a Wolper production. And, he said when they used to preface his showcase of movies, he said, nobody gave us a chance to even do this. They didn't think this would, and it ended up being the top rated show that they had done. So it showed that even in the mid 70s, you could tap into this interest. And so definitely. I imagine that these Bigfoot movies, you're going to see more and more of them. Willow Creek obviously was pretty successful on a national level.
Yeah.
But yeah. Some of the older stuff from the 70s, I do like it, even though it's, it's a little hokey.
Yeah.
But
there was definitely
Kolchak, the Night Stalker. We grew up on that.
Yeah. There's just some of those really campy ones from back in the day. Sasquatch, not the Journey, but there's a bunch of them. There's one also, I think it was like the Abominable Snowman or something along those lines, and it was they captured this Yeti-like creature in Minnesota or somewhere. It was just the music, the themes that the music they had was just so comical. And I saw it a few years ago and I thought it was really great.
Well, I tell you, we had a filmmaker or a cameraman here one day, and we hit a common chord because it was the $6 Million Man episode of Bigfoot. And back in the 70s, that has touched a chord. All I had to do was bring that up, and it floods back memories. And of course, it's Andre the Giant. And then later it was Ted Cassidy, Lurch from the Addams Family. And so it touched a chord back then in the mid 1970s, the Bigfoot phenomena with even shows like the $6 Million Man. I just got in the mail today a T-shirt with Lee Majors and Andre the Giant, Bionic Buddies. So I mean, so it's just one of those. That was a kind of a magical time period for me when I grew up, and my generation really touched a chord with that particular episode.
Definitely, and it's coming up in the comments. We have somebody saying $6 Million Man fighting the Bigfoot scared the heck out of me when I was a kid. All sorts of comments. I mean, I'd say just in terms of folks who grew up in that period, the most common stuff that I hear is what brought them in as an interest into Bigfoot. If it wasn't that they were directly an eyewitness, was either the Patterson-Gimlin footage or the Legend of Boggy Creek, or usually the $6 Million Man. That's kind of the third that I usually hear in terms of what brought people's interest into this.
Yeah, I think you're right. That the Legend of Boggy Creek definitely touched a chord. And for people that were a little younger, maybe In Search Of, the Leonard Nimoy hosted documentary, definitely that was around, I think, 76, 77 when that came into existence. And the Alan Landsberg production that only was going to go for a few years, and they ended up getting like 7 years out of it.
Yeah, and there's other people in the comments saying, have you seen Exists? I haven't watched it, but it's really well done compared to others. So Exists was actually done by the guy who directed the Blair Witch Project. Oh,
really?
And a very cool movie. Yeah, I mean, it's done in that sort of way. And another comment says, I felt the producer either had their own sighting or they listened to enough encounters to get it right. And that's for this movie Exists, which is something I've heard as well. And it is a good movie. Check it out, guys. If you like the subject, you will not be disappointed. And Chris Spitzer as well says, Exist for sure. One of the few that took the topic seriously. Oh, and the comments are finally loading again. So here's that comment from Chris. And then Guy15 says, has anyone seen the Littlefoot movie? It was basically about a baby Bigfoot. That was my childhood. Yeah, there's so many. And that's something that I think culturally just Bigfoot is just a really good marketing tool. It's free. It's not copyrighted like Mickey Mouse or some of the other characters we know. It's anyone can use Bigfoot, from beef jerky to video games. My generation folks have grown up in video games with Bigfoot as being like a side mission. You go find Bigfoot, or there may be Bigfoot in the mountain region of the map on a video game. So there's a lot of cool stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But so one thing I wanted to ask you, I want to make sure to ask you is you've written or contributed to a number of books about these topics, famously Bigfoot Encounters in New York and New England. I think that was with your brother, as well as Northwoods Bigfoot, or Bigfoot in Northwoods, and with Bruce Hallenbeck and some other folks. How did those come into the works? Was it just a culmination of all the research you guys had been doing and you wanted to put it out there, or what was the inspiration behind the books?
Yeah, when we looked at John Green's book, that would have been 1978, and we just expanded the research. So we were able to get, hundreds of sightings where there were, literally just a few. And so we saw that there was definitely a lot of material that could be reported. So there were a group of researchers together and combined forces and put out Monsters of the Northwoods. And that was in 92. And then Bob and myself did Bigfoot Encounters in New York and New England. Bruce Hallenbeck has done Bigfoot Encounters in New York there and in New Jersey with Lauren Coleman as well. So, I mean, there's a lot of material out there, and that's what we did. And we just actually, my brother and I just have another book out on mysteries of the Northwoods, on
Yeah.
a whole slew of strange phenomena, and that'll be out shortly. It's actually in the done stages. It's just a matter of getting it circulated now, and that will talk about things like the La Cabana restaurant in 1973 when something landed there and actually changed the water taps from running hot to cold and cold to hot. And no one knows what it was that landed. It was during a major UFO flap. And we have incidents like that along the Aber Road incident, these modern sightings, sightings of catamounts. My uncle, who was a doctor at the Mayo Clinic, he was able to film a catamount in Vermont in his home in Pulteney. And he had friends with him. They watched it as it walked across the field. They took pictures of it. They had surveillance footage of it. When he called the authorities over there, they said, the only catamounts are mascots for the sports teams. So I mean, that's the response that you're often given. But this book,
I heard that story.
This book will incorporate all the different mysteries, and there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of really strange things that haven't been adequately explained, and perhaps the same way that John Keel back in the 60s, in the same way that researchers like Brad Steiger started recording this. It's more in that type of tradition.
Awesome. I'm really excited for it. I'm sure other folks are as well. I'm excited to check out the catamount section. As you know, mountain lions and mystery big cats, big thing in my interest as well, with my recent film Lions of the East, talking about stuff in Vermont. And just the response seems to be everywhere is the same, that you're getting this mixed response from the authorities that they're here, but they're really not. Now they're sort of starting to say, well, we have stragglers coming from the west. So I can imagine 20, 30 years ago, there was probably a lot more denial going on.
Well, I went into a barber shop in Rutland, right across from where I used to work. I work in New York State now. But I got in the chair and I said something about a catamount sighting. And there must have been, 8 or 9 people, all sitting around waiting for their turn at the haircut. Every single one of them had talked about a catamount sighting, every one, including the barber who was cutting my hair. And he said that he saw one jump the length of a road with the long tail, and he said it was black. So the catamount sightings are, I think, extremely populous and extremely underreported. And, it doesn't surprise me at all when someone reports a catamount. It's almost unusual if you don't hear a sighting very often.
Absolutely. It's one of the things that's the reason why I did the project in the first place, was going to a lot of these events in the New England area, asking people about their Bigfoot sightings, their UFO encounters. And something that came up time and time again was the catamounts, the mountain lions, the cougars that were being seen in these areas. And when I was in school in Connecticut, 2011, I remember hearing the story of that one that was killed by a car that was supposedly from the Dakotas. And then I coincidentally met a police officer who saw it a few days before it was killed, and he got the same ridicule until they actually recovered the body. So as I kind of said, he's the only person in New England who has had a confirmed sighting that had a carcass that, either wasn't taken away or kind of denied from the start. So it's an interesting topic, and I think it's a good lens to view maybe the rest of these more bizarre topics, because people can wrap their head around there being mountain lions, but you see the way the authorities and others treat it. Maybe that's sort of analogous to the way the Bigfoot subject or UFO subject is treated by officialdom, or whatever we want to call it.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that's pretty clear. If there's a long tail, and this is a big cat, it's about all that could be. And sometimes black, sometimes the classic, tannish color. It doesn't matter. It just, there isn't much else it could be.
Right. And that's the thing, is you have so many different types of eyewitnesses, from police officers, mayors, politicians, painters, artists, all sorts of people, wilderness guides, hunters, people that spend time out in the woods. And when they all describe that characteristic, especially when the black or melanistic ones pop up, those are particularly interesting, I feel. And I think you posted this recently, a photo that was supposedly taken in the Whitehall area of a catamount.
There was one, geez, I can't recall the date, maybe a year ago. It was up in Putnam, and it was actually taken by my mother-in-law.
Wow.
And the other one that has a lot of credence is the one that my uncle had taken. And, you know, they may not be perfect pictures, but they're certainly pretty tantalizing. And there's no problem with credibility. It's as honest as they come. It's just a matter of what is it. It's just like that picture of whatever Frank Szynski was able to get on his trail cam over in Bombazine. Right. This large creature grabbing. There's no question about sincerity here. It's just a matter of what is it.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's the golden question with a lot of this sort of evidence and stuff that's put forward. Matt Barnes actually says, grew up in Orwell, had a UPS driver stop at our farm in the 90s, quite shaken up that a catamount ran from one of our pastures right in front of his truck. Very interesting.
Sounds like a typical reaper.
It does. And then Bill Murs asks, is there some type of Bigfoot museum in Whitehall?
There are several spots in town that you can go for a photo op or something like that. Yeah. Where you would have, there's a statue at the golf course. There's a statue at the soapstone store. There's a statue at Joe's Pizza. There's a statue at the pavilion in the park. And there's certain areas that you can go to that, you know, there's a sign for the country club and things like that. As far as a museum, there's actually a museum on the maritime stuff, on the birthplace of the U.S. Navy. And we don't have an exhibit yet on Bigfoot, but we're still working on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just a great area. I would recommend anyone checking it out. If you're interested in doing a really fun road trip, maybe you're from the Northeast, start down from Whitehall, go up to Burlington. You're going to get the Bigfoot stuff. You're going to get Champ, American history, Fort Ticonderoga. You got the Star Trek thing up there near Lake George. Just so much. There's just so much great stuff to see, and you're in a beautiful scenery. You've got the lake there and the Green Mountains on one side and the Adirondacks on the other. So you can't really go wrong if you're into nature and into this kind of stuff.
I'm glad you mentioned that. The Star Trek exhibit and set tour up in Ticonderoga is stunning. And if anybody's a Star Trek fan, you won't believe it. You got to see it to believe it. They've actually brought in people like William Shatner and other Nichelle Nichols and Walter Koenig and so forth. And obviously with the pandemic, it's still open now, but it'll be a while probably before the stars come back. But right now, that museum's open every week. So yeah, the Northeast is still, it's got so many different areas you can't go wrong. You're absolutely right.
Absolutely. Jonathan Wilkes says, thanks for a great episode. Thank you for tuning in, John, for being awesome. And Douglas here says, made the pilgrimage to Abear Road last fall. Loved every minute of it. Yeah, how could you not?
Excellent.
And that's something, that, like you said, the Northeast is great. Somebody was leaving a comment earlier saying, oh, why do you only interview people from the Northeast about Bigfoot? And that's not true at all. I have plenty of other episodes with Meldrum and Cliff Barrickman and other folks. And they're saying, oh, interview some people from the South. Well, next week, Lyle Blackburn's on. Lots of other people from other parts of the country. It's not strictly about Bigfoot. We talk about all kinds of stuff, as we've talked about with Paul, about Champ and the UFOs and a lot of the other stuff too. So where can people get in touch with you, Paul, if they'd like to talk about their stories? Maybe they have stuff going on in their area, or they're geographically, they have something to share. Where can people get in touch with you?
Sure. There's a couple ways you can reach me right on Facebook at Paul Bartholomew, and be easy enough to find my picture there. You can also contact me at yeti1@yahoo.com.
Awesome. I have your Facebook linked below, so you guys can contact him there if you have anything going on. And wow, just really awesome to have you on, and great to talk about this area. And it was awesome meeting you a while ago here, and hopefully when things start calming down, when the Sasquatch Calling Festival is back, be able to hang out there as well.
Yeah, that was very disappointed this year, because last year we had 3,500 people show up, and far beyond what we had expected. And we're hoping to even expand it further this year. So, the pandemic has put a damper on it, but, let's look forward to next year. And, if you're ever in Whitehall, drop in.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's unfortunate. I think most events, like 98% of all events that were scheduled for this year are basically toast, which is a bummer. But I think for those of us interested in these topics and that like these events, we have a lot to look forward to in the next year. It's going to be tough to maybe decide which ones to go to or which ones to attend, but that's a problem for a better time, for example. But either way, Paul, it's been fantastic having you on here. Thanks so much for coming on.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it very much, and look forward to meeting you again sometime.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys as well for your awesome questions and comments. Appreciate it as always. As I mentioned, next week we'll have Lyle Blackburn on. We're going to be talking about Bigfoot in the South and some of the stuff he's been up to. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, please subscribe and just drop a comment if you like what's going on, maybe some suggestions about people to have on. So thank you guys again, and hope to see you next week, guys. Everyone have a good night.